Hi, David.
Hi, Josh.
How you doing?
Doing fine. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Let me introduce us. I am Josh Summers, a Boston-based meditation and yoga teacher, and you are David Barash, an evolutionary biologist and a professor of psychology at University of Washington. So far, correct?
Absolutely.
Great. You've also authored numerous books. Wikipedia says approximately 30. I thought that was an interesting qualifier, just approximately 30. But the book you've written that we're going to be discussing today is called Buddhist Biology, Ancient Eastern Wisdom Meets Modern Western Science. And as the title of the book suggests, we'll be discussing how Buddhism and biology converge, possibly how they diverge. But as an opening question for you, or point of inquiry, I can imagine that a hardcore biologist, someone say like Richard Dawkins, might not necessarily be very amenable to hearing that biology might benefit from a Buddhist insight around his field. And I can also imagine a hardcore Buddhist not really being that interested in any kind of biological insight around his strenuous striving for inner peace. So, as an opening question, obviously I think you think that these two fields can benefit from dialogue with one another. And what is that benefit that you see?
Well, that's a big question, and the book as a whole is an effort to try to get my arms around that benefit. I know Richard Dawkins really quite well. I actually knew him before he wrote The Selfish Gene, and we've maintained our friendship ever since. I'm very much a biologist. I describe myself as an aspiring Buddhist, which some may consider an oxymoron, since according to some people, Buddhists are not supposed to aspire, or at least not yearn too strongly. I think they do contribute a great deal to each other. To my biologist friends, I would emphasize that, at least as far as my perception is concerned, the value of Buddhism is not as a, quote, religion, close quote, as such. I'm really not terribly inspired by or interested in the metaphysical aspects or the clearly religious aspects of Buddhism. I think what Buddhism offers to biology and frankly to everyone else is a philosophy, essentially, a way of looking at the world and particularly looking at life that is very open to empiricism and very open to experience and knowledge and wisdom, and does not imply the supernatural. Now, there are components of Buddhism that do involve the supernatural, and frankly, that's where Buddhism and I part company. But I think when it comes to some of the fundamental underlying concepts of Buddhism, if you exclude the supernatural, there's a great deal that is relevant, that is, in fact, altogether consistent with biology.
So do you sort of, I mean, one phrase that came to mind when I was reading your book is I felt like you were taking kind of a biological scalpel to Buddhism and sort of extracting the supernatural stuff, and what was left you found had convergence with a biological sensibility around things.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I take as a model of sorts the so-called Jefferson Bible,
Hmm.
where Thomas Jefferson famously or infamously, according to some people, took literally a scissors to the Bible and removed references to the supernatural, but retained those components that spoke of ethics and wisdom. And I think one can and should do the same thing with any belief tradition.
Right.
And with regard to Buddhism, it's not so much a matter of belief as it is a matter of proposed wisdom and the suggestion that we look into it and see whether it works. And with regard to that, I think there are a number of components, which I imagine we'll start talking about now, in which Buddhism really does converge in a really extraordinary way with biology. There are three primary components, at least as far as I'm concerned. One is so-called anatman, which is the lack of self, or selfness, non-self. Anitya, which is impermanence. And here's a longer word, pratitya samutpada, which is basically interconnectedness. Each of those, well, all three of those are, they interpenetrate with each other.
Right.
And they also very much help to help to clarify some really important concepts in biology. We're talking about hardcore concepts like genetics, physiology, ecology, etc.
So yeah, I wanted to get into those. So let's maybe start with the first. I'm more of an early Buddhist student, so I use anicca, but you use the Sanskrit anitya.
Anitya, either
Yeah.
one word.
So both these words are translated to mean non-self, or the doctrine of non-self. And
That's we're talking about anatman would be not self.
oh, and what did you say?
I said anitya.
Oh, sorry. Anatta. Sorry, I got my anatta. Thanks for catching that. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we're dealing with the doctrine of non-self, and kind of the paradox around this. One of the paradoxes is that a lot of people, I think, that get drawn to Buddhism or Buddhist practice in a modern context are actually usually going for sort of self-help reasons.
That is an interesting paradox.
And then they discover that a core teaching of this thing that they're following is that there is no self, or that the thing that they take to be self is really non-self. And it kind of can get summed up in a recent New Yorker cartoon I saw, where a guy was going into a bookstore looking for a book on Vipassana, which is a style of Buddhist meditation, and the clerk says, "Vipassana, that's in the no self-help section." So this is really one of the slipperiest, most confusing, maybe core teachings of the Buddha. So help me unpack that. When you hear non-self, what does that mean from a biological or philosophical perspective?
Sure. Let me emphasize first what it does not mean, because I think this is often confusing, particularly for Westerners. It does not mean that Buddhists claim that you don't exist, or that I don't exist, that we don't have a name and a place, and we're surrounded by skin and we can be identified as such, and that we have memories as to our past and expectations as to our future. I mean, even the Dalai Lama, when he buys a ticket, or someone buys him a plane ticket, it has his name on it, and he sits down on a seat, and Buddhists aren't fools. There's no question that individuals exist in the simple, direct, literal sense. But what is significant for Buddhists and for biologists is not that individuals as such can't be identified, but rather that individuals don't exist in a fundamental, meaningful sense, that we are fundamentally meaningfully and genuinely connected to the rest of the world in such a way that to make a separation between us and the rest of the world is itself an artifice and profoundly misleading. Let me give you two metaphors that are, I think, useful to understand this. One would be, think about what does it mean to get a hold of one's self as a piece of fruit. We are not an apricot, for instance, where you cut away the outside and then you get to this hard kernel of independent selfhood, which I guess many people in Western religious traditions would identify as a soul.
Right.
For Buddhists and biologists, there is no hard core in there. It's more like an onion. You keep peeling away layers, but eventually you find that there is nothing there that is distinct from everything else. There is no hard, independent core. Another metaphor that I think is helpful is that of a whirlpool in a river or a stream. Mm-hmm. You look at the whirlpool and it exists, just like you exist and I exist and those people watching this video exist and know that they do. On the other hand, where is the whirlpool? What is it? It doesn't have a separate, independent existence. It is literally a function of material energy and matter passing through a given structure of sorts that we identify as a whirlpool, and it's real. If you're in a canoe and it's a big whirlpool, you want to be aware of it and watch out for it. But it does not have an independent existence, and in that sense, we delude ourselves by thinking we have independent existences. And this is something that ecologists are very aware of: is that you can't really study, for instance, a single bison if you want to understand the evolution of bisons or how they work or what they are, how they came to be. You have to look at the bison-prairie interaction and that of many different bisons and wolves and the entire ecosystem. And in that literal sense, ourselves are parts of an ecosystem and really only maximally meaningful when we recognize that. So again, anatman, not self, does not mean the simplistic notion that we simply don't exist and we're all deluded. It means that we don't exist in those rigid categories that much of Western thought has induced people to expect.
Right. So there's the lack of clear separation.
Another way of saying
Our sense of self that we have is deeply embedded in an ecosystem from which it emerges. It's not separate from that. You also write about how there's the intuitive sense, I think, sort of more of a psychological intuitive sense that there's a homunculus inside our brain, that this CEO that's able to control the levers of things, that very strong intuitive sense that I think a lot of people have also in itself is not permanent, or it's not unchanging, and it's also dependent on a variety of factors for its arising.
Yeah, and it's misleading too. It's profoundly misleading. The image of somehow a little green dude inside our head that is the controller. It reminds me, there's a wonderful scene in the movie Men in Black in which there's a corpse comes into a morgue and they open up the head, and inside the corpse turned out to be not really a human but a robot, and there's a little Martian type green dude inside the head who's actually doing things. But of course then you'd have to ask, well, what's inside the green dude's head? And so the idea, again, it's not just ecology, for instance, and evolution, but neurobiology too speaks very directly to the fact that there is no hard single core of selfhood, that our neurons, our brains, are a function of an interconnected network.
Mm-hmm. Right.
By the way, you introduced a lovely joke, Josh, from the New Yorker cartoon. There's another joke I particularly like. It wasn't from the New Yorker, but the question arises: what did the Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? And it is, "Make me one with everything." And of course, it's not quite a joke. I mean, we really are one with everything. But again, that can be it's almost too easy to say. And after having said that, it's all too easy to go on and ignore the wisdom behind that. But there is profound wisdom behind that.
Right. And I think this is one of the themes that I wanted to explore with you, is that biology seems to take a kind of objective study of the world. That there's this world out there that can be examined through the eye and the lens, or the instruments of the eye, and sort of observed objectively. And Buddhist practice, the epistemological process is more subjective. You're not looking externally as much. There's more of an internal process of examining your inner experience, and through the subjective experience, gaining insight about the way things are. And kind of picking up on what you just said, I think the biological knowledge that is arrived at tends to give a kind of cognitive, intellectual understanding of things, which doesn't necessarily get its way down into one's bones in terms of really living from that truth, or living from that direct perception that you are intimately non-separate from everything that is.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I have to confess that in terms of whatever wisdom I have to convey, does not speak directly to the question of subjective experience. That looking at biology and Buddhism as very much a scientist and frankly an atheist, my interest and concern, and I think what I have to offer, mm-hmm. is more the convergence with regard to these objective truths. Mm-hmm. I think the issue of subjectivity is one in which there isn't that much convergence, as far as I can see, between Buddhism and science. There certainly is some, but I think that's one of the areas, and there are other areas too, where I think a scientific discipline like biology and a obviously somewhat more spiritual discipline like Buddhism do tend to diverge rather than converge. I'm
Well,
into the subjective, but I don't think I have a whole lot of wisdom to convey about that.
well, yeah. Well, let me frame it differently. I mean, I think that in Buddhism, the philosophy emerges out of subjective experience,
Right.
right?
True.
So
Right.
you're finding overlap between like biology and these doctrines of Buddhism that are convergent, but those Buddhist views are emerging out of direct subjective um, sense of things.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where I think a lot of that wisdom came from. But as far as I'm concerned, what's of greater interest and practical value in terms of conveying to others is that wisdom itself, that perception, regardless of where it came, um,
Okay,
whether
so
it came from
I think
purely subjective experience or from empirical studies.
right. I think part of this question is going to resurface when we come back to the issue of engagement and
Hmm.
and how does one live moving forward from these truths or influenced and informed by these truths. Um, the next core doctrine I think you talk about in the book, actually it might be impermanence, but that one I feel like is fairly easy to grok for most people. The idea that like everything's changing, and as most of my Buddhist teachers say, that to know that things are changing doesn't really profoundly change much. You have to really know it deeply inside of you and like sort of a DNA level to really have some change in your life be affected by that truth. The one that I also find very interesting, though, is the teaching that paticca samuppada, or
Right.
how did you say it in Sanskrit?
Paticca samutpada, but
It's
I've heard it pronounced in many different ways.
right, and this is how I have heard the translation as dependent, the teaching of dependent origination,
Right, right, or dependent
the
co-arising,
dependent co-arising, right,
right.
which isn't really all that different in a certain sense from the anatta teaching. Right? It's sort of saying that it's sort of going from the micro level of the individual or the self to more of a broader global level, that nothing, the Buddha is essentially saying nothing arises independently of anything else, or everything arises due to certain causes and conditions, nothing arises exclusively on its own.
Absolutely, and that it connects what I call anatman and anicca as well, impermanence. These are all intimately interconnected. They're examples of that interconnection and that the dependent co-arising, if you will. Um, Absolutely, and
So,
sorry.
well, in the early Buddhist teaching, which I know that doctrine is used to sort of give a very detailed analysis about how sort of individual suffering arises and then comes to cease. Whether that you take that in sort of a psychological level, like it's how your own distress arises and then comes to cease, you see all the factors that co-arise with that arising of distress, or if you take it in more of a sort of the supernatural metaphysical level of reincarnation, how you come to be reborn again and again and again. That cycle is meant to describe that process or the mechanism by which that process comes about. But in later Buddhism, it sort of takes on a flavor of interbeing or deep interconnection with all of the web of life. And I was wondering if you could speak to that development or the implications of that development.
Sure. I think I'm glad you raised that because one of the interesting um, divergences, at least between early Buddhism and modern, we could call it ethics or modern biology, is that the notion of dependent co-arising or codependent or origination, there are lots of terms for this, was actually seen by the early Buddhists, and to a large extent the Buddha himself apparently, as a trap, as a problem, as something that individual practitioners, if you put quotes around individual, I suppose, that practitioners would be well advised to escape from, that the world was a dangerous place full of misleading connections that we need to sever. And that was part of early Buddhism. It wasn't the only part, but it certainly was part. More recently, the notion of interbeing, as it's been developed by current Buddhist practitioners, and one can trace history of this as well, turns that around to some extent and says by virtue of this interconnection, And by virtue of our profound connectedness to other things, this implies to a very large extent a kind of obligation upon individuals to behave in a way that maximizes the well-being of all things. Now, one of the classic lines in Buddhism, of course, is for the benefit of all sentient beings.
Right.
I'm not sure how one separates sentience from non-sentience certainly among living things. I'm not one of these people who believes that the universe itself is sentient, or that rocks are sentient, or that we part company there.
Right.
But I do think that many other living things are sentient to various degrees.
Brussels sprouts?
I'm sorry?
Brussels sprouts, for instance?
Yes, exactly. I wouldn't put a whole lot of faith in the consciousness of Brussels sprouts, although they're certainly responsive when they're alive and growing. Whether they perceive themselves as alive and growing, I rather doubt. But I do think we have an obligation to all living things, and perhaps an obligation that increases in proportion as those living things do possess a kind of sentience.
Just define sentience for me. I'm trying. I know I've used the term so many times. I'm like, what does that actually refer to at the moment?
I was afraid you were going to ask that. Actually, I think, to my mind, sentience is synonymous with consciousness, and consciousness, again, is not an easy thing to define. I have a number of animals, and my animals, particularly dogs and cats and horses, are highly aware of their environment. In many cases, much more aware than I am, much more attuned to any number of things going on. I'm not sure they're conscious or sentient in the human sense, insofar as being aware of being aware.
Yeah, self-conscious or
self-awareness, self-consciousness, and that would be my sense of what sentience implies.
Okay. So in the book, you then, in examining these core sort of Buddhist tenets of non-self, change or impermanence, and dependent origination, you then move into sections on engagement, sort of, which you just were hinting at, sort of engagement beyond these philosophies into how do these inform your life? How do they create a kind of philosophy towards life?
Yeah, I think here we get a very explicit, maybe not explicit, implicit wisdom and suggestions for literal implications for rather than to withdraw the classic image of the Himalayan sage up there alone on the mountain or in a cave somewhere, is one way of responding to connectedness by feeling again that connectedness is a trap. But I think a far more, for my mind, more meaningful and more salutary response is to engage that engagement with regard to how one lives. Mm-hmm. And this raises, among other things, another important concept both in Buddhism and in biology or ethics, which has to do with karma. Now, karma is perceived by many people in the West is some sort of history that we drag along with us, based not only on our past behaviors, but on the past activities of our ancestors. If you take that sense literally from Buddhism, it does not make sense in biology, as far as I'm concerned. On the other hand, if you take karma to mean, as the Dalai Lama himself suggested, literally cause and effect, the doctrine of cause and effect, that what one does has consequences. What you have done has consequences. And in fact, what your ancestors did has consequences. As an evolutionary biologist, we can say that what our ancestors did has consequences in terms of which genes were promoted into future generations, some of which wound up in you and me and those watching this video, as opposed to others. So there is a karmic consequence literally at the level of DNA. And so we do carry around karma, not, I think, because of our literal behavior in past lives, but because of the behavior of our ancestors and those genes that were promoted by virtue of that, and that also imply what's going to happen in the future. So the notion of karma, as far as I'm concerned, is really intimately connected to the notion of responsibility.
Yeah, and picking up on that, part of what you get in the book is that you introduce this idea of part of freedom is in some ways being disobedient to the impulses that we've inherited through, you could say, our genetic karma. Does that sound like a fair characterization?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, Richard Dawkins, in his Selfish Gene, a book with which I very much identify, concluded by pointing out that we alone among living things may have the ability to say no to our selfish genes, that we have a degree of personal freedom, free will. And that's very consistent with the Buddhist conception as well. Mm-hmm. And so part of our karma, ironically, as human beings, I think possibly unique in the living world, is the ability to define ourselves and choose our own path of life within limits, clearly. Right, I mean, we can't live like a Brussels sprout or a honeybee. But within the confines, if you will, of being a human being, we are, as Jean-Paul Sartre pointed out, condemned to be free, which is a fascinating irony in itself. In a literal sense, we have no choice but to be free.
Right. So this gets us to the sort of the concluding chapter in your book, where you lay out a kind of a manifesto for engaged living, or a philosophy for life, moving out from these philosophies, and you bring together this interesting trifecta of existentialism, biology, and Buddhism. I think you call it existential-bio-Buddhism.
Yeah, I think I don't believe that term had ever been coined before, for better or worse.
I don't know why that wasn't the title of the book.
Well,
did the publishers give you pushback on that?
I did. I actually did suggest, in fact, precisely that. But both my agent and the publisher felt that would be just terrifying for many potential readers, although I'd like to think it would be appealing for others. It certainly describes what I'm getting at, and I'm glad you pointed it out as a trifecta. That's the way I hope it will be perceived.
Right. And so, what does each bring to bear in your view on sort of creating a philosophy for life?
Okay. Well, I guess what needs to be added here, and we've talked some about biology and Buddhism. What needs to be added specifically then would be existentialism here. And in some ways, existentialism superficially seems to go quite counter to a biological perspective. Right. Some of the classic statements in existentialism are that human beings are, Simone de Beauvoir said that human beings are l'être dont l'être est de n'être pas, which is that the human beings are those beings whose being is having no being. But what that
sounds Buddhist.
Yeah, right. It does. It's certainly Buddhist, but it's not very biological, since biology would emphasize, among other things, our genomes. I mean, we do inherit a genome. We have a genome. There's a kind of being there, for sure. But what the existentialists emphasize, among other things that I think is really relevant here, is the freedom to define ourselves. First of all, I should add, it emphasizes the role of subjective experience, as you raised earlier, which is very important for an existential perspective. And also the notion, really important notion, that we define ourselves by how we live, and what we believe to be true of ourselves is really not nearly as relevant as what we actually do with ourselves. Right.
This actually resonates with I remember a Buddhist chant that I remember having to do on a retreat once, where something about, it was a chant around karma, where you repeat, like, I am the owner of my action, the heir to my action, this kind of thing. I am defined by the kinds of actions I make with my life.
Precisely, yes. And that's, and I think that's really key. It's key to Buddhism. It's key to existentialism. It also, to my mind, helps to overcome what is one of the potential ethical problems with existentialism, which is, at least in terms of the sort of modern French flavor of existentialism, there's very little within that philosophy itself. There's actually very little that specifies what we should do, how we should behave. It's more a function that in order to avoid what they call bad faith, we need to behave in a manner that is intentional and conscious.
Right. There's no direction. There's no directive around how you behave. It's just that you behave consciously.
Exactly. And if you follow that precept, if you will, that could equally well be used to buttress a perspective that I would find really anathema, a far right-wing, anti-environmental, anti-human rights, anti-life perspective. If that's the way you believe and that's the way you behave, then more power to you. Now, interestingly, Sartre himself and Camus and others were, in fact, generally fairly significantly socially engaged rather than disengaged. But it took a little bit of a wiggle for them to justify, if we're really free, what is the basis then for validating one kind of behavior over another? And I think the basis that, at least that I come up with, and that I would urge others to seriously consider, is if you look at interconnectedness, given the reality, the fundamental deep reality of interconnectedness, then the question of how we should behave to some extent answers itself. It speaks, among other things, to what's often referred to as the golden rule, the notion of treating others as you would like them to treat you, and recognizing, if you recognize the interconnectedness between yourself and others and other living things and maybe the planet as a whole, then to some extent you have your marching orders, or if not orders, at least you have a direction and suggestions that I think are really quite meaningful.
Yeah, and connected to that, I often have heard that sort of advanced meditators, whether it's the Dalai Lama or these advanced spiritual teachers, it's not that they've said it themselves, but it's sort of said about them that their sense of self has identified not with their individual body and mind, or like with their individual national culture or anything like that. It's actually their sense of self has expanded so far that it's inclusive of the entire planet, if you will, or the biosphere. And so they sort of are responding to things on that level. I'm sorry. No.
Well, I find that admirable, and more than admirable. I find that really in touch with some fundamental, maybe the fundamental truth of science and of the cosmos, at the risk of sounding grandiose. One of my favorite Buddhist teachers, the Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh, wrote very effectively at one point about, of course, he was talking about in the old days when we actually had paper, and he was writing on paper, and in the book he said, if you look at this paper, if you are an ecologist or if you are a master of one sort or another, you can see the cloud in this piece of paper. Of course, there is a cloud in the paper. The paper came from trees. The trees only grew by virtue of water and clouds. And of course, there's not just clouds. There's the logger, and there's the gasoline that powered the chainsaw, and there's the logger's lunch. And the notion of things being contained within everything else is, I think, a profound statement not only of biological and Buddhistic truth, but one that should power to some extent the ethics of our own behavior.
Right. Within that trifecta, do you see, as I'm listening to you talk, it strikes me that Buddhism in a way kind of strikes a middle ground between the objective reality that's revealed through biological science and sort of the existential imperative to act from freedom or from conscious choice, that Buddhism in a way in the middle gives one a direct subjective sense of those biological truths. Like you feel like sort of the inherited karma of your genes and the impulses to run away from something or to hoard something or to act out on these sort of the three poisons that are referred to in Buddhism: the greed, hatred, and delusion. You sort of acknowledge them enough so that you are able to create a space between yourself, your action, and those impulses, and act from greater freedom.
Right. Yes, I think that's really true. I think one of the important take-home messages that I'd like to convey, and at the risk of I don't want to conclude by sounding negative, but would be, I mean it in a positive vein, would be against fundamentalisms, whatever the source of those fundamentalisms. And I think even science, biology, can fall victim to a kind of fundamentalism in terms of its emphasis on reductionism, although I think much of what we learn comes from reductionism, but not all. And I would sort of caution against that, and I would caution against a Buddhist-based fundamentalism as well. And in that sense, it's very consistent with your point that I think what is a useful take-home message is the freedom or even the obligation that we have to take wisdom and insight where we can get it without necessarily feeling that we have to sign on to everything if there are some aspects that aren't consistent with our own intuitions. And I think in that sense, Buddhism, I guess you could call it Buddhism light, Buddhism without the supernatural. But the Buddha himself said, I'm not a god and I should not be worshipped. Although if you go to Asia, as I have, and I mentioned many have, you find people worshipping statues of the Buddha as though he were a god. And you find people worshipping a kind of scientism too, as though it's the equivalent of a secular god. And I think we need to take a coherent view of all of these things.
Yeah, and very much in line with that, I think one of the points I took from your book was that these systems, whether it's biology, Buddhism, or existentialism, any of these systems are also subject to anatta, anicca, and and paticca samuppada themselves, that they are changing, that they're not permanent, they're not separate from other conditions, and that they are going to be developing and evolving as they go.
Yeah, one of the things I love about Thich Nhat Hanh's order of interbeing is that one of his fundamental precepts is don't accept any precept as necessarily and automatically true, including this one, which is great fun.
It is great fun. David, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Your book, Buddhist Biology, is a tremendous read. I highly recommend it. And just thanks so much.
Thank you, Josh. I enjoyed it too.
Yeah. All right.